Imagine using a stone the size of a car as money, not carrying it in your pocket or storing it somewhere safe, but simply knowing that it exists somewhere on the island and that everyone around you agrees that it belongs to you, because that alone is enough for it to function as currency. At first, that sounds absurd, almost like a joke. But for centuries, it worked perfectly well on Yap Island, and more importantly, it reveals something uncomfortable about how money actually works. Because this story isn't really about stones at all, it's about a deeper question that most people never stop to think about, which is what actually gives money its value in the first place. Long before banks existed, before central currencies were standardized, and long before anything like digital payments or credit systems appeared, the people of Yap had already built a functioning monetary system, but instead of coins or paper, they used massive limestone discs known as ryestones, some of which were small enough to carry, while others were so large that moving them required entire groups of people. What made this system even more fascinating is that these stones didn't even come from Yap itself, but from distant islands located hundreds of kilometers away, which meant that acquiring one was not a simple transaction but a dangerous expedition across open ocean where sailors had to face storms, uncertainty, and the very real risk of never returning. Because of that, the value of each stone was never just about the object itself, but about the story attached to it, including how far it had traveled, who had brought it back, and how difficult or dangerous the journey had been, which meant that value was not physical but narrative. And yet, the most surprising part of the system is that the stones didn't even need to move in order to function as money, because when ownership changed, people didn't physically transport the stone across the island. They simply acknowledged that it now belonged to someone else, and that shared understanding was enough to complete the transaction. There is even a famous case where a stone was lost at sea during transport and sank to the bottom of the ocean, meaning no one could see it or touch it anymore, and yet it continued to be used as money because everyone knew it existed and agreed on its ownership. At this point, it might be tempting to dismiss this system as primitive or unsophisticated, but the uncomfortable truth is that it is much closer to modern finance than most people would like to admit. Because today, the majority of money does not exist physically either, as it lives in digital records, bank databases, and institutional agreements, where value is not something you can hold, but something you trust to be there. When you check your bank account balance, you're not actually holding money in your hands, but relying on a system that records ownership and expects everyone else to recognize it. And that is exactly what the people of Yap understood centuries ago, that money was never about the object itself, but about the trust that surrounds it. However, like all systems built on trust, it worked only as long as the conditions that supported it remained stable, because eventually outsiders arrived, bringing with them new technologies, better ships, and different economic assumptions. As these technologies made it easier to travel and transport stones, what had once been rare and difficult to obtain became increasingly accessible, which slowly but fundamentally changed the system. Because once the effort required to create money decreases, its perceived value begins to weaken, and the connection between scarcity and worth starts to break down. In other words, what Yap experienced was something that modern economies know very well, even if they don't always recognize it immediately, which is inflation. The system didn't collapse instantly, but it gradually lost strength, not because the stones themselves changed, but because the shared belief that gave them value began to shift. And that is the key insight, because the people of Yap didn't fail due to ignorance or simplicity, but because their system depended on conditions that eventually changed beyond their control. The same pattern appears again and again in modern financial systems, where stability often feels permanent until something disrupts the underlying trust that holds everything together. Currencies do not collapse because paper disappears or numbers vanish, but because confidence erodes, and once that happens, value follows. So when you look at a rhinestone, you're not looking at something distant or irrelevant, but at a reflection of the system you are living in today, where value exists not because of what something is made of, but because people collectively agree that it has value. And once that agreement disappears, the system itself begins to unravel. Because in the end, money is not gold, it is not paper, and it is not digital code, but trust. And Yap understood that long before the modern world did. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe to Capital Historian, Because history doesn't just explain the past, it reveals the system you are already living inside.